Eliza Whitmore's hand shot out so fast that Mara didn't have time to step back. 1 second, Mara was standing at the edge of the gathering crowd, trying to make herself small the way she always did at these things. Shoulders dropped, eyes down, hoping nobody would notice her the way they always noticed her for the wrong reasons. The next second, Eliza's fingers had locked around her wrist, and the grip was surprisingly hard for someone who'd spent her whole life avoiding hard things. Take her instead. Eliza's voice cut clean through every conversation in that room. It wasn't whispered. It wasn't mumbled in embarrassment. It was the kind of voice a person uses when they want to be heard, bright and clear and absolutely certain of itself. She was built for your ranch. She can handle the dirt and the work. The laughter came fast. It always did in Red Hollow. If you've ever stood in a room full of people laughing at you, not with you at you, then you know what Mara felt in that moment. That specific kind of cold that starts somewhere behind your sternum and spreads outward until your hands go numb. That particular silence that lives inside you even when everyone around you is making noise. Mara was 32 years old. She had been carrying things her whole life, but nothing had ever felt quite this heavy. What would you do if every person you'd ever helped turned their back and laughed? If this story already has you feeling something, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and follow Mara's story all the way to its end, because what comes next is the kind of thing most people never see coming. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning and find out how one woman's worst moment became the foundation of everything she would eventually build. The Whitmore Ranch sat 3 miles outside of Red Hollow, Wyoming, on a stretch of land that the county had more or less forgotten about. The soil was decent in a good year, poor in a bad one, and the past several years had leaned hard toward poor. The fence line needed work on the eastern side. The barn roof had developed a soft spot above the south-facing corner that let in rain when the wind shifted. The water trough in the main corral had been leaking slow for 2 seasons, losing about a quarter of its capacity every week, which meant someone had to keep filling it more often than they should have needed to. That someone was Mara. She'd been the someone for as long as she could remember. Her father, Gerald Whitmore, had been a solid man once, the kind of rancher who could look at a piece of land and tell you what it wanted, who understood weather and animals with the quiet fluency of someone who'd grown up alongside both. But a hard fall from his horse 4 years back had left him with a hip that ached when it rained and knees that had started giving him trouble standing up from a seated position. He still came out in the mornings. He still put his boots on and walked the property and offered his opinions on what needed doing. But the doing itself had gradually, quietly shifted to Mara. Not to Eliza. Eliza was 26 and beautiful in the specific way that Red Hollow valued most. Slight and fair, with dark hair. She kept carefully pinned and an easy smile that made people feel warm when they were near her. She was the sister people noticed first, the one they spoke to at church gatherings and general store counters. The one older women complimented on her posture and young men tried to impress with stories about their prospects. Eliza had grown up being chosen. It was the only life she knew. Mara had grown up being useful, which sounds similar, but isn't. The morning that everything changed started the way most of Mara's mornings started, before the light was fully up, with the animals making their first sounds, and the cold still sitting in the air with that particular bite that didn't let go until nearly 9 o'clock. She'd been out to check on the older mare, who'd been favoring her left foreleg for 2 days, and she'd decided the swelling was soft enough that it wasn't a break, but still wanted watching. She'd re-wrapped the leg with the strips of clean cloth she kept in the small kit she'd assembled herself from, supplies she bought in town with her own money. Her father never remembered to reorder them. And she'd given the mare some water and a quiet word, and then she'd gone to find out what else needed doing. The answer, as usual, was several things. The post on the east fence's third section had worked itself loose from the ground again. It was the same post she'd reset twice before, and she'd been suspicious for a while that the problem wasn't the setting, but the post itself. That the base had rotted enough that no amount of repacking dirt around it was going to hold it long term. She'd told her father this. He'd agreed with her assessment, said they'd get a new post next time someone made a supply run. That had been 6 weeks ago. In the meantime, the post kept working loose, and the wire kept going slack, And the 3 cattle they had who'd figured this out kept testing the boundary every few days to see if today was the day they could get through. Mara dug out the post by hand, working the bar down alongside it to break the soil loose, and then reset it deeper than before, and packed it with rocks she'd collected from the dry creek bed on the south end of the property. It wasn't the right fix. She knew it wasn't the right fix. But it would hold another few weeks, which was what they had. By the time she finished, her hands were gray with dirt to the wrist, and her shoulders were aching in the way they usually did by late morning, a dull, persistent pull across the top of her back that she'd stopped noticing years ago, except when she was especially tired. She wiped her hands on her work trousers, the heavy canvas ones she wore for fence work and heavy lifting, the ones Eliza had once asked her, genuinely puzzled, why she didn't just throw away. And she walked back toward the barn to check whether the feed supplies were going to last through the end of the week. They weren't. She needed to make a run into town. She was calculating the cost of oats against what she had left in the household account. And she knew the number wasn't comfortable, knew it the way you know a bruise by touching it, that particular familiarity with a pain that doesn't fully resolve. When she heard Eliza calling from the house. "Mara, come inside. Father wants to speak to us." Gerald Whitmore was sitting at the kitchen table when Mara came in, still brushing dirt from her sleeves because she hadn't had time to clean up properly. He had the look he got when he was carrying something he wasn't quite sure how to put down, a certain stillness around his eyes, his hands flat on the table in front of him. "Sit," he said. Eliza was already seated across from him, her back straight, her hands folded. She'd been in the house all morning. Her dress was clean. Mara sat. "There's a man coming to Red Hollow," Gerald said. "Colton Vance. You've heard the name." Everyone in the territory had heard the name. Colton Vance owned Blackstone Ranch, which wasn't just a ranch in the way that the Whitmore place was a ranch. It was something closer to its own country, thousands of acres of the hardest, most productive land in the Northern Territories, with more cattle and horses than most towns had people. He'd inherited the core of it from his father, and then doubled it through sheer relentless work. And he was known across 4 counties as someone who didn't make deals he didn't intend to honor, and didn't ask for things he wasn't prepared to take seriously. He was also, as of the past year, unmarried. His wife had died in childbirth 18 months ago. The baby hadn't survived either. "He's looking for a wife," Gerald said. "A partner is the word people are using. Someone to stand beside him on that land." He paused and looked at both of them, and Mara understood immediately what the pause meant. Not because her father said anything unkind, he didn't, not directly, but because the way he looked at Eliza when he said partner was different from the way he looked at Mara. Softer, more hopeful. "The Hendersons are hosting a gathering Friday evening," Gerald continued. "Both of you will come." Eliza's composure broke open into something brilliant and immediate. She started talking about what she'd wear and what she'd heard about Vance, and whether his eyes were really as blue as the Hendersons' daughter had claimed they were. Her voice filled the kitchen the way her voice always filled a room. Easily, naturally, with that particular warmth that made people lean toward her. Mara said she needed to get back to the fence. She went. She'd known Eliza her whole life, which meant she'd known a certain kind of loneliness her whole life. The specific loneliness of being in a family and somehow still being on the outside of it. It wasn't that her father didn't love her, she believed he did, in the way that practical men love the things that work reliably, with a kind of taken-for-granted appreciation that rarely gets spoken aloud because it doesn't seem to need to be. He relied on her. He trusted her judgment on the land. He said her name when something needed fixing. He just never looked at her the way he looked at Eliza. She thought about that as she worked through the afternoon, moving from the fence to the water trough seal she'd been patching with the compound she'd mixed herself, to the barn roof's soft spot, which she accessed by climbing to the ridge and working down. Not gracefully, not quickly, but deliberately and without falling, which was the thing that actually mattered. She thought about what it would mean for Eliza to be chosen by someone like Colton Vance, and whether that would be good for Eliza, and what it would mean for their father and for the ranch. She didn't let herself think about what it would mean for herself because that particular line of thinking hadn't ever led anywhere useful. That evening, when she came inside and washed up and sat down to the supper she'd helped prepare because Eliza had been occupied thinking about Friday, Gerald said, "You should come to the gathering looking your best, Mara." She looked at him. "I always look my best," she said. He had the decency not to clarify what he meant. Friday came the way uncomfortable things tend to come, too fast, and then somehow also too slow, the way time bends around events you're dreading. Mara wore her cleanest dress, which was blue and well made, because she'd sewn it herself and she was good at careful work. She'd taken down her hair and repinned it with more attention than usual, not because she thought it would make a significant difference, but because she respected the effort of trying. Her hands were her hands, large, scarred at the knuckles, with short, practical nails and calluses on the palms. She looked at them before she left the house and thought about putting gloves on, and then she didn't. The Hendersons' place was warm and crowded in the specific way of frontier social gatherings, where everyone came who was going to come, and there wasn't any filtering for rank or connection, because in a territory this size, you couldn't afford to pretend those distinctions existed. The table along the east wall had food on it. The fireplace was doing its job. Someone had brought a fiddle. Colton Vance was already there. He was not what Mara had expected, though she hadn't spent much energy on expecting. He was tall and had the build of a man who worked his own land rather than overseeing others working it. There was a difference she could recognize on sight, having spent her life among men who did and didn't. His face was weathered but not unkind, with lines at the corners of his eyes that could have been from sun or from grief or from both. He wore good clothes but wore them like someone who didn't think about them much. I was standing near the fireplace talking to George Henderson when Mara arrived, and he glanced toward the door when the Whitmores came in, the way people do in small gatherings because arrivals are noticed. His eyes moved across all three of them, Gerald, Eliza, Mara, and then he returned to his conversation. Eliza noticed the glance and straightened almost imperceptibly. For the next hour, the gathering moved around Vance the way water moves around a stone, not toward him exactly, but always aware of where he was. He spoke to several people, listened more than he talked, and occasionally smiled at something with the slightly delayed quality of a man whose mind was never fully off his work. Women from 3 families found reasons to be nearby. Eliza positioned herself beautifully, naturally, with the practiced ease of someone who had been navigating these situations since she was 14. Mara spent most of that hour near the food table, refilling her cup of cider twice, and having a conversation with old Tom Briggs about his shoulder that had been bothering him since the weather turned, because Tom's wife had died last spring, and he didn't have many people who asked him how he was feeling. She wasn't watching Vance particularly, but she noticed when he moved, and she noticed when he moved toward them. Not toward Eliza, at least not initially. He stopped and spoke to her father first, and she watched their faces as they talked, watching the quality of attention in Vance's expression, the particular way he asked questions and then waited for the actual answer. He was the kind of man who listened in complete sentences, which was rarer than it should have been. Then he said something to her father that made Gerald glance toward Eliza, and Eliza's posture did the thing it did when she was trying to look like she wasn't paying attention to something she was absolutely paying attention to. Mara stepped back toward the wall. What she didn't see, because she wasn't watching from the right angle, and because it happened in the short moment she'd turned to set down her cup, was Colton Vance looking across the room and watching her walk away from the food table, watching the way she moved through the crowd, making space for herself with her shoulders without bumping anyone, watching the brief exchange with Tom Briggs, the way old Tom laughed at whatever she'd said to him. Vance filed that away the way practical men file things that seem relevant. Then he went back to talking to Gerald Whitmore about the territory's winter feed conditions. The trouble started, as trouble in Red Hollow usually started, when the evening loosened up. The fiddle player got going in earnest, and the furniture got pushed back, and people started moving around more freely, the way they do when there's music and they've been standing still too long. The gathering had that warm, slightly restless quality that precedes either dancing or argument, sometimes both. Mara was near the door that led to the back porch, thinking about whether it was late enough that she could reasonably suggest they head home, when she felt the shift in the room. It was the kind of shift you feel before you understand it. A change in the sound pattern, conversation stopping in a ripple effect, attention swinging like a compass needle finding north. She looked toward the center of the room. Colton Vance was walking toward the Whitmore family corner. Not walking, crossing. There was something deliberate, the particular quality of a man who has made up his mind about something and is now in the business of acting on it rather than reconsidering it. The crowd did what crowds do around powerful men. It made room without quite meaning to. Eliza's face opened with something bright and certain. She touched her hair, one small, unconscious gesture, and straightened. Beside her, Gerald's expression settled into a careful kind of hope. Even from across the room, Mara could read it. She'd known her father's face for 32 years. She stepped back again, pulling herself out of whatever was about to happen, giving it room. And then Eliza's hand locked around her wrist. The grip was harder than she'd expected. Eliza had never struck her as a person with much physical force. She'd avoided physical force her whole life, the way some people avoid uncomfortable rooms. But what she lacked in practice, she was apparently making up for in urgency. Mara had time for one lurching moment of confusion. What is she doing? And then Eliza shoved her. Not pushed, shoved, both hands. Forward. Take her instead. The voice was clear and carrying, and the room heard it. She was built for your ranch. She can handle the dirt and the work. The laughter erupted from at least 3 directions at once. Mara recognized individual voices in it. Martha Egan's high particular giggle, the Crandall brothers who never needed much of a reason to find something funny, younger voices she didn't know as well. It spread fast the way fire spreads in dry grass. One small ignition point, and then suddenly it's everywhere. She was standing in the center of the floor. She wasn't sure exactly how she'd gotten there. Eliza was behind her, and the part of Mara's mind that was still working clearly registered that Eliza had put 2 or 3 feet of distance between them with very little drama, as if she had simply relocated to somewhere with better air. Mara looked at her hands, still dirty, a little, at the knuckle creases, because there are some things that don't wash fully out, no matter how carefully you try. Colton Vance was standing 4 feet in front of her. He was not laughing, he was looking at her hands. And the expression on his face was not what she expected. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't the polite blankness people use when they're trying to pretend they didn't witness something embarrassing, and it wasn't the slightly pained social discomfort of a man who finds himself at the center of someone else's drama. He looked at her hands with the specific, focused attention of a man looking at something valuable. The laughter was still going. It was loud. It had taken on its own momentum now, the way crowd sound does when it no longer needs the original reason to sustain itself. Mara had spent 32 years learning how to take up less space in moments like this, how to compress herself down to something manageable, something that didn't require anyone else to deal with. She was very good at it. She could feel herself starting to do it now. The familiar internal drawing in, the careful removal of feeling from the surface of her face, the whole practiced business of becoming harder to see. Colton Vance stepped forward. He moved in close enough that the next thing he said was meant for her specifically, not for the room, even though the room eventually got quiet enough to hear it anyway. Your fence post on the south property line, Chimturen, he said. You reset it yourself. She looked up at him, genuinely startled, and the startlement cracked through the careful surface before she could stop it. I saw it on my way through the eastern approach, he said. 3 weeks ago, and again this week. Different depth, rock-packed base. Whoever did that knew what they were doing. The laughter had quieted in that uneven way of laughter that isn't sure whether it should keep going. That was me, Mara said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. I know, Vance said. He looked at her then, not at her size, not at her hands again, but at her face. And there was something in his expression she didn't have an immediate name for, something between recognition and relief. I've been watching this town for 2 days, he said. I've seen a great many things people want me to believe about them. He paused, and something shifted in the set of his jaw. I haven't seen much that's true. The room was quiet now. That full, uncomfortable quiet of people who aren't sure they're meant to be hearing something. You, Vance said, are the first true thing I've seen. Mara Whitmore stood in the center of the Henderson gathering floor, with the laughter gone quiet, and the fiddle stopped and 40-something people watching, and she felt something happen inside her that she couldn't quite name, something cracking open where she'd kept a door locked for so long she'd almost forgotten the lock was there. She didn't cry. She wasn't built for crying in front of people. But her eyes went bright, and if you were close enough, you could see it. Vance spoke to her for the next few minutes, quiet and direct, asking her about the ranch and her father's situation and the eastern fence line, asking practical questions the way a man asks about something that matters to him. She answered them. She had answers, clear, specific, honest ones. She'd lived inside this land for 32 years. She knew it the way you know a thing you've struggled alongside. It took her a while to realize the room had moved back to its own business, conversation resuming at the edges, the fiddle starting up again tentatively. Eliza had drifted to the far wall and was speaking to someone with her back mostly turned. Gerald Whitmore was standing near the door with an expression Mara couldn't fully read. Something complicated and a little ashamed, and also maybe something like gratitude, though the gratitude sat uncomfortably alongside everything else. At the end of the conversation, Vance looked at her steadily and said, "I'll call on your father in the morning." Mara understood what that meant. She thought she should say something, but she didn't have the right words yet, and she'd spent enough of her life saying things without the right words, when silence would have served better. She nodded. He nodded back. And then he walked back through the room, and the people who had laughed 20 minutes ago watched him go with the careful faces of people reassessing something they'd been certain about. Mara stood where she was for a long moment. The fire in the Henderson hearth was warm across her left side. The fiddle had found its rhythm again. Someone near the food table said something and got a laugh, small and genuine, the ordinary kind. She thought about the fence post. The way Vance had noticed a fence post she'd reset 3 miles outside of town, in passing, and remembered it. The way he'd filed it away as something worth knowing. She thought about the look on his face when he'd looked at her hands. She thought about her sister, who had shoved her into the center of a room to be laughed at, and how that was a thing she would have to find a way to understand, and how that was going to take longer than one evening. She also thought, in the morning, someone is coming to call, and it would not be Eliza he was calling on. The thought was so strange and new and vertiginous that she had to hold very still for a moment, the way you hold still when the ground has done something unexpected beneath your feet, and you're not quite certain yet that it's going to hold. It held. She picked up her cup of cider from the windowsill where she'd set it down earlier, and she drank the rest of it. It was cold by then. She didn't mind cold things. Around her the gathering continued, and the fiddle played, and the fire burned down a little, and the night outside the Henderson windows was dark and enormous. The way Wyoming nights were dark and enormous, full of land and wind and the kind of silence that has texture to it, that is made out of distance and weather, and the breathing of animals, and the weight of everything that goes on without asking anyone's permission. Red Hollow would talk tomorrow. It would talk for weeks, probably. The town had a long memory for humiliation, other people's humiliation, and a story this good would make the rounds at every counter and table for a while. But what the town would be talking about, Mara already knew, was not quite the story that had actually happened. The story that had actually happened was something more private and more complicated than what the town would get to see. It was the story of a woman standing in a room full of laughter, with her hands still dirty from honest work, and a man looking at those hands like they were proof of something. It was the story of being seen. She set down her empty cup. She found her father. She told him quietly that Colton Vance would be calling in the morning, and she watched his face do the complicated thing it did when life didn't go the direction he'd expected. Then she helped him with his coat. His hip was bothering him, and she could tell before he said anything the particular way he shifted his weight. And she held the door, and they walked out into the Wyoming dark together, the three of them, with the fiddle fading behind them and the stars overhead doing what stars always did, which was simply continuing, indifferent and enormous, and there. Mara Whitmore breathed in the cold air and let it fill her up. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow comes regardless. Colton Vance arrived at the Whitmore Ranch at 7:45 in the morning, which was earlier than Gerald had expected, and exactly when Mara had expected, because a man who noticed fence posts on a casual ride-through was not a man who kept loose hours. She heard the horse before she saw it. She was already in the yard, splitting the last of the wood she'd meant to get to 2 days ago, and the sound of a single horse moving at a working pace up the ranch road was different enough from the occasional wagon or pair of riders that she knew before she looked up. She set the axe down against the block. She didn't brush the wood chips off her sleeves, because there wasn't time, and because there was a part of her that had decided, sometime between last night and this morning, that she was done making herself smaller than she was. Vance dismounted at the gate and tied his horse to the post there, correctly, with a knot that would hold but release easy, the kind of knot a person tied when they respected other people's equipment. He was wearing the same kind of clothes as the night before, good quality, worn without ceremony. He carried his hat in his hand rather than on his head. He saw her standing by the woodpile and walked toward her instead of toward the house. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Vance." She gestured toward the porch. "My father's inside. He's been expecting you." "I know." He stopped a few feet away and looked at the woodpile. The split wood she'd stacked, the block, the axe. "You've been at this since before sunrise." It wasn't a question. "The cold snapped back last night," she said. "We needed more dry wood than I thought." He nodded slowly, the way he'd nodded at her the night before, like he was filing the information somewhere useful. "I'd like to speak with you before I speak with your father, if you're willing." That surprised her. She didn't try to hide that it surprised her. "All right." They stood in the yard rather than sitting, which suited her. She'd never been good at conversations that required her to sit still while something important was being said. Vance looked at the ranch with the eyes of a man doing a quiet assessment, and she watched him doing it, and she could see him reading the same things she'd been reading for years. The fence line, the barn roof's compromised corner, the water situation at the main corral. "Your father's hip," Vance said. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," she said. "He won't say so." "They never do." He turned and looked at her directly. "I'm going to be straightforward with you, because I think you're a person who prefers that." "I do," she said. "I came to Red Hollow with a specific purpose. I need a partner for Blackstone Ranch. Not in the decorative sense of the word." He said this without inflection, not unkindly, but flatly, the way you state a requirement rather than an apology. "My land is hard. The winters are brutal in a way that people here don't fully understand until they've lived through one. I have 43 ranch hands, and I'm responsible for all of them, and I have cattle and horses that represent my entire financial position, and I cannot afford to have a partner who treats the role as something to endure between social occasions." Mara looked at him. The morning light was flat and gray and honest, the kind of light that doesn't do anyone any favors, and she thought about what she looked like in it. Big-shouldered, work-worn, with her hair pulled back and wood chips on her sleeves. And she thought, well, here it is. "I understand what you're describing," she said. "I know you do. That's why I'm talking to you." He paused, and something in his expression shifted. Not softened, exactly, but became more careful. "Last night wasn't how I intended to proceed. I want you to know that. I had already spoken with your father about calling this morning. What your sister did—" He stopped, his jaw set. "That was her decision, and I won't insult you by making light of it." Mara was quiet for a moment. A crow landed on the top rail of the corral fence and looked at them with the frank, unconcerned assessment that crows had, and then it left. "What are you offering?" she said. "A marriage. A real one, not a performance of one. Shared responsibility over Blackstone Ranch and everything that comes with it, the work, the decisions, the hard years. I'll settle your father's debt with Harlan Briggs." He said the last name with a particular neutrality that told her he knew exactly what Harlan Briggs was and had formed an opinion about it. "Not as a transaction, as a gesture of respect for the family I'm asking to take someone from." Mara had known about her father's debt to Harlan Briggs since the previous spring, when she'd found the paperwork in the drawer her father thought she didn't look in. Briggs owned a feed supply operation and had his fingers in 3 other ventures in the county and was the kind of man who extended credit to struggling ranchers with the specific intention of eventually owning something they cared about. The debt wasn't ruinous yet, but it was getting there. She'd been trying to think of a way around it for 8 months. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "Why me?" "Specifically." She held his gaze. "Not last night's reasons. Your reasons, the ones you had before last night." He was quiet for a beat, and she had the sense that he was weighing something. Not the answer, but how honest to be with it. "I lost my wife and my child 18 months ago," he said. "And I spent about 6 months after that trying to figure out if I could run that ranch alone. I can't. Not because I'm not capable of the work, but because a ranch that size needs 2 minds on it, and one of them needs to be someone who understands the land the way I understand it. Intuitively, from the body outward. Not theoretically." He looked at the Whitmore fence line again. "I've met a great many people in the past year who were interested in Blackstone Ranch. I have not met anyone who interested me. Until I rode through the eastern approach 3 weeks ago and saw a fence post that someone had reset with their own hands, using resources they found on site. A brief pause. That post is still standing, Mara said. It'll hold another month if the ground doesn't freeze too hard. I know, he said. But the point is that someone knew to pack it with stone rather than just resetting it in loose soil. Someone thought it through. She looked at him for a long moment. The gray light was getting a little warmer as the sun climbed, and the ranch was making its morning sounds around them. The animals stirring, the particular creak of the barn in the wind. I'll speak with my father, she said. Thank you, Vance said. And he meant it, in the specific way of a person who doesn't say things they don't mean. Gerald Whitmore sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and listened to Vance speak with the focused attention of a man hearing something he doesn't quite know what to do with. Mara sat across from them both and said very little, because this was her father's conversation to have, even if the outcome concerned her most directly, and because she was watching Gerald's face and reading it the way she'd read it her whole life. He was proud. That was the main thing. Underneath the complexity, the mild shame from last night, the guilty relief that kept surfacing around the edges, there was something that looked a lot like pride, and it was aimed at her, and she wasn't quite used to seeing it aimed at her so plainly. Vance spoke clearly about the debt, about the terms of what he was offering, about what he expected from the marriage, and what Mara could expect in return. He didn't dress anything up or make it sound more romantic than it was. He talked about it like a man discussing a serious partnership with another serious person, which was, she realized, sitting there, probably the most respectful thing anyone had done for her in years. Gerald said, "You understand she's not—" He stopped and started again. "She's not what most men are looking for." Vance looked at him with an expression that was very nearly impatience. "I know what I'm looking for, Mr. Whitmore. I've spent the better part of a year looking for it." Gerald was quiet. Then he said slowly, "She's the backbone of this place. I want you to know that. Whatever you've seen, whatever made you decide, she's the reason this ranch hasn't gone under." "I know that too," Vance said. Gerald looked at his coffee. His hands wrapped around the cup were older than Mara usually let herself notice, spotted and a little stiff at the knuckles. Ranch hands from a different decade, before the hip, before the knees, before time had done what time does. "Then I suppose," he said, "I don't have much to object to." Mara looked at her father. He looked back at her, and in the look was everything they hadn't said to each other in the past 15 years. The apologies that had never quite made it into words. The acknowledgments that had gotten buried under the daily weight of just keeping things going. It wasn't a comfortable look. It wasn't resolved. But it was honest, and for her family, honest was already something. "All right," she said. Well, they married 12 days later, in a small ceremony at the Red Hollow County office, with Gerald and 2 witnesses from Vance's business dealings as the only attendants. Eliza did not come. She had sent a note to the house 3 days after the Henderson gathering, and Mara had read it and put it in the drawer beside the Briggs paperwork, because she didn't know yet what to do with it, and she wasn't going to pretend she did. The ride to Blackstone Ranch took 2.5 days. Vance had sent his wagon ahead with her things. There weren't many. She'd always owned less than she'd worked with, and they made the journey on horseback, which she preferred. The territory changed as they moved north, the land opening up into something bigger and more demanding, the vegetation thinning and the sky getting wider and the temperature dropping a consistent 4 or 5 degrees that you felt first in your ears and then in your hands. They talked during the ride. Not constantly. Vance was not a man who talked to fill silence, and neither was she. But in the way that 2 people talk when they're moving toward something together and they're trying to get their bearings with each other. He told her about the ranch's layout, the current state of the cattle operation, 2 ongoing disputes with neighboring landowners that she'd need to understand. She asked questions, the kind of specific questions that told him she was listening closely and building a picture. On the second evening, they made camp near a creek bed, and while the fire established itself and the horses settled, he told her about Clara, his wife. He said the name simply and without flinching, and she understood that he'd made a deliberate choice to say it, to give Clara her name, her place, rather than referring to her sideways as my late wife, or not at all. "She was from Illinois," he said. "She came west thinking it would be an adventure." "Was it?" "The wrong kind." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. She was a good woman, and she deserved more preparation than I gave her. I was so certain the ranch would speak for itself that I didn't think to tell her what the winters were actually like. He paused. I won't make that mistake again. So I'm going to tell you, the winters at Blackstone are worse than you're imagining. No matter what you're imagining right now, add 30% to it. Mara considered this. What's the worst thing about them, specifically? The isolation, he said immediately. Not the cold. People expect the cold. The isolation catches them. You can go 2 weeks without being able to reach another human being outside the ranch, and that's in a normal year. The land becomes the entire world. That doesn't frighten me, she said. He looked at her. No, he said, after a moment. I don't suppose it does. She thought about asking him whether Clara had been frightened by it, and then she decided not to, because that question belonged to a different kind of conversation than the one they were having, and they weren't there yet. Maybe they'd get there. She didn't know him well enough to know. She knew she wanted to, which was not something she'd expected. Blackstone Ranch came into view on the third morning, and it was larger than she'd pictured, even accounting for the numbers she'd been told. The main house was 2 stories and solidly built, with a covered porch running the full length of the front and a kitchen addition on the south side that looked newer than the rest. The barn was enormous. She could see 2 horses through the open doors, and she knew there were more inside. The bunkhouse, the equipment sheds, the separate structure she'd learned was used for winter feed storage. The whole compound had a purposeful density to it, everything arranged around function, nothing decorative. Around it, in every direction, was the land, thousands of acres of it, open and demanding and entirely indifferent to what anyone thought of it. She breathed it in. She had the distinct physical sensation of something large enough to be worth her full strength, and the feeling that came with it was not quite comfortable. It was bigger than comfortable, but it was right. The ranch hands were a different matter. There were 11 of them present when the wagon came in, and Vance's man Dal brought the horses around, and they watched her arrive with the collective assessment of men who have been doing something difficult for a long time and have developed strong opinions about who is and isn't equipped to understand it. They were polite. They were the specific kind of polite that has a wall behind it. She caught their looks without making it obvious that she'd caught them. The quick sizing up, the careful blankness when they realized she'd noticed. One of them, the oldest, a weathered man named Hoskins, who had the posture of someone who'd spent decades on horseback, gave her a nod that was technically respectful and practically neutral. She nodded back. Vance introduced her simply and briefly, the way she'd expected, her name, her role, the expectation of respect. He didn't oversell her or explain her or apologize for her presence. She appreciated that more than she could have said. What she didn't expect was what happened after the introduction was over, and Vance went inside to speak with his foreman about something that had come up during the days he'd been away. She was left in the yard with the wagon and her things and the ranch around her, and one of the younger hands, early 20s, lean, with the specific bravado of a young man in front of his peers, said to no one in particular, just loud enough, "Suppose she can haul fence posts at least." The yard went quiet in the way of yards, where people are waiting to see what happens next. Mara looked at the young man. She took her time about it. He had the decency to look slightly less certain than he had a moment before, but not uncertain enough to take it back. "What's your name?" she said. "Pete Calloway," he said. "Pete." She glanced around the yard, the equipment, the layout, the specific arrangements that told her things about how the work was organized here. That split in the south bunkhouse window frame. Is that new, or has it been there a while? He blinked. What? The window frame, south-facing, second from the left. There's a split in the wood, upper right corner. Cold air comes in. Has it been there since before the last freeze, or did the freeze open it? Calloway turned involuntarily to look at the bunkhouse, which meant he knew exactly which window she was talking about. "Since before," he muttered. "Then the wood's dried out enough that it's going to split further before spring, and you'll lose the whole frame." She picked up one of her bags from the wagon. "I'd get to it before the next hard freeze, but that's your call." She carried her bag toward the house. Hoskins, she noticed from her peripheral vision, was watching her go with an expression that was no longer neutral. The inside of the main house was functional and clean, in a way that suggested people maintained it out of discipline rather than affection. The furniture was solid and well made, bought for durability. The kitchen had a cast iron range that was serious equipment and a larder that was well stocked in a way that reflected someone's careful planning. The bedroom she'd been given, their bedroom, she corrected herself, had a large window facing north that showed nothing but land for as far as she could see. She stood at that window for a few minutes after putting her bag down. The land looked back at her the way land does, with complete patience and zero concern. She heard Vance's footsteps in the hall, and then he appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. He held one out to her without asking whether she wanted it, because it was early morning after a long journey, and coffee was not a question at this point in the day. She took it. It was strong. "The men," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to do anything about it." "I know that too." He came to stand beside her at the window, looking out at the same view she was looking at. "They'll come around or they won't. Most of them will. Hoskins runs the daily operations, and when Hoskins decides something, the younger ones follow. He's watching you." I noticed. He watched Clara for 3 months before he said more than 10 words to her. A brief pause. He was very sorry when she died. More than I expected. Mara drank her coffee. Outside, the land went on. "I need to understand the operation fully," she said. "The books, the supply accounts, the grazing rotation, the contracts, everything. I can't be useful until I know what I'm working with. The office is at the end of the hall. I'll show you after breakfast." He glanced sideways at her. "There are some problems in the accounts. I want you to know that going in. I found some things this past summer that I'm still working through." "What kind of problems?" "The kind that suggests someone has been taking advantage of the ledger keeping." He said it flat and precise. "I replaced the man who was managing the books in August, but I haven't been able to determine the full extent of the damage yet." She set down her cup on the windowsill. "I want to look at everything from the past 3 years." "I was hoping you'd say that." She turned away from the window and the view and the enormity of the land outside it. "Then let's eat quickly," she said. "Awesome." Breakfast in the Blackstone kitchen was a different kind of meal than breakfast at the Whitmore ranch had ever been. The ranch hand who handled the cooking, a barrel-shaped man named Ott, who Mara would learn had been with Blackstone for 16 years and had strong opinions about biscuit flour, produced a practical and substantial spread. Eggs, bacon, cornbread, the large pot of coffee that Mara noted was already her second favorite thing about the ranch. She ate at the main table with Vance and Hoskins and 2 other senior hands, which was apparently the normal arrangement. The younger hands ate at the long table in the adjacent room, which she could hear but not fully see. The conversation at the main table was about practical things, a section of the northern boundary fence that needed repair before winter hit in earnest, the condition of the cattle after the recent cold snap, a supply delivery from Harker's that was 2 days late, and whether someone needed to ride to find out why. Mara listened more than she talked. She asked 3 questions, all specific, and each one created a small pause, not an unfriendly one, but the pause of people recalibrating their expectations. Hoskins answered all 3 questions directly, and with more information than she'd asked for, which she took as a sign that he'd decided at some level to at least see what she was working with before he made up his mind about her. After breakfast, Vance took her to the office. The ledgers were in worse shape than she'd been prepared for. Not the physical books. Those were organized. But the numbers inside them, which told a story over the past 2 years that had all the hallmarks of someone systematically skimming from several different account categories in amounts small enough not to be obvious in any single entry, but significant in aggregate. She sat at the desk and went through them page by page while Vance stood in the doorway and occasionally answered her questions, and by midday she had a rough sketch of the pattern, and by late afternoon she had a number. It was not a small number. She told Vance the number. His expression didn't change much, but his jaw set, and she could see the particular tightness of a man who has already suspected something and is now having the suspicion confirmed with precision. "That's more than I'd calculated," he said. "You were looking for the obvious discrepancies. The method was designed to avoid those." She tapped the ledger open in front of her. He was pulling from 4 categories simultaneously, small amounts from each, and then compensating in the quarterly summaries with inflated supply costs. It would have been very hard to catch without going line by line. "Can you document it?" "I already have," she said. "I've been noting the entries as I went." She looked up at him. "Do you want to pursue it legally?" "Yes." No hesitation. Then we need to be exact. Every discrepancy, fully documented, with the original supplier invoices to compare against. Do you have those? Some of them. We'll need to request the others. All right, she said. That's going to take time, but it's worth doing correctly. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she'd first seen at the Henderson gathering when he'd looked at her hands. Recognition, and something that was maybe closer to relief than she'd been willing to name before. You've done this kind of work before, he said. I've managed accounts. Smaller scale, but the principles are the same. She closed the current ledger and pulled the one from the year before toward her. My father's books weren't always in order. I learned to find the problems. Vance was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the man who did this. His name is Garrett. He's still in the county. I suspected as much, Mara said. He has... Vance paused, choosing the word carefully. Connections. With some of the other landowners in the area. Men who'd prefer that Blackstone Ranch operate at less than full strength. Mara looked at him steadily. Then we need the documentation to be ironclad, not just enough to confront him, enough to take to a court. Yes. Then I'll need more time in here. Take all the time you need, Vance said. The office is yours. The first week at Blackstone Ranch was, on balance, harder than Mara had expected, and she had expected it to be quite hard. The scale of the operation meant that the scope of what she didn't yet know was enormous. There were systems and histories and ongoing situations that had developed over years before she arrived, and learning them all simultaneously while also trying to prove herself to men who hadn't decided to trust her yet was a constant demand on her attention that didn't let up even at the end of the day. She woke early, and she went to bed late, and she spent a great deal of time in between doing whatever needed doing without waiting to be asked, because waiting to be asked was how you got left out of things, and she didn't have time to be left out of things. She fixed the bunkhouse window frame on the third day. She went to the supply shed, found the seasoned wood she needed, and did it in the early evening before supper without mentioning it to anyone. Calloway found it the next morning, and she wasn't present when he did. But Hoskins mentioned it to her at breakfast with a look that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. She made mistakes too. She gave an instruction about the water rotation that conflicted with a system the men had worked out during the previous dry season, and it created a mess that took 3 hours to untangle and cost them an afternoon they didn't have. She owned it directly, without excuses, at supper that evening, telling the table plainly that she'd spoken before she understood the full situation and she wouldn't repeat that. The room was quiet. Then Hoskins said, "The system we worked out in the dry season has some problems of its own. Probably worth looking at both." It was the most he had said to her voluntarily since she arrived. She said, "After supper, if you have time." He did. They sat at the kitchen table for an hour and a half with a rough map of the water sources and Mara's notes and Hoskins' 20 years of working knowledge of the land, and by the end of it, they had a better rotation than either system alone had provided. Hoskins rolled up the map when they were done and looked at her sideways. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it for a moment. "Something that needed more explaining," he said. She looked at her hands, still dirty, still scarred, the way they'd always been. And she said, "Most people make that mistake." Outside, the Wyoming night had settled in fully, dark and cold and enormous, the wind moving against the main house walls with the particular persistence of wind that has a great deal of open space behind it. The fire in the kitchen hearth was burning well. The ranch was quiet around them, the animals settled, the work of the day officially over, even if her mind was still running through ledger columns and water rotation calculations and the list of things she needed to understand better by tomorrow. This was her life now. 43 people depending on decisions she'd helped make. Thousands of acres that asked nothing except everything you had. A husband who looked at her like she was a solution he'd been searching for. And a set of account books that told a story of someone trying to quietly destroy all of it from the inside. She thought about Garrett, who was still in the county with his connections and his careful small thefts. She thought about this documentation she was building, entry by entry, and how it was going to need to be exact and complete and unassailable before it did what it needed to do. She wasn't finished yet, not by a long way, but she was started. And starting, she had always believed, was the part that required the most courage. Not the dramatic, recognizable kind of courage, but the quieter kind, the kind that gets up before sunrise and does the work that's in front of it and keeps a careful, honest account of everything it finds along the way. She banked the kitchen fire before she went to bed. The wind kept on outside. The documentation took 6 weeks to complete. 6 weeks of early mornings at the office desk before the ranch came fully awake, of cross-referencing supplier invoices against ledger entries, of building a paper chain so precise and so complete that there would be no reasonable interpretation of it other than the one it plainly showed. Mara worked through it the way she worked through everything, methodically, without rushing, checking each conclusion twice before she let herself believe it. She'd learned from managing her father's accounts that the worst thing you could do with financial evidence was get excited about what you thought you were finding before you'd confirmed what you were actually finding. Excitement made you sloppy. Sloppiness made you wrong. Wrong gave the other person the only weapon they needed. She was not going to give Garrett that weapon. His full name was Douglas Garrett, and she learned more about him as the weeks went on. Not through gossip, which she avoided, but through the account records themselves, which told their own kind of story about a person's character and methods. He had been meticulous in the early period of his scheme, careful to keep the individual amounts small and the intervals irregular. But as the months went on, the confidence had grown, and with confidence had come a loosening of the caution, and in the final 8 months before Vance had dismissed him, the pattern had become almost careless. Not careless enough to be obvious without close examination, but careless enough that once you had the key to the pattern, the later entries practically documented themselves. He'd taken nearly $4,000 over 2 years. In some operations, that might have been survivable. In an operation trying to establish itself through a drought cycle and a bad winter, it had created problems that cascaded outward in ways that weren't immediately visible. Equipment that should have been replaced wasn't. A repair on the south pasture fence that got deferred and then deferred again until the fence failed during a cattle push, and they'd lost 2 days recovering the animals. Small failures with compounding effects. Vance looked at her completed documentation on a Thursday evening in November, sitting at the office desk while Mara stood at the window looking out at the dark. He went through it slowly, page by page, with the focused attention of a man who was letting himself understand something difficult without flinching from it. When he finished, he set the last page down and was quiet for a while. "This is sufficient," he said. "More than sufficient," she said. "The county judge in Faro handled 2 similar cases in the past 4 years. I looked into his record through the land office correspondence. He's not sympathetic to this kind of thing." Vance looked at her. "When did you look into his record?" 3 weeks ago. I wrote to the Faro land office for copies of the relevant public filings." She turned from the window. "I didn't mention it because I wanted to confirm the documentation first. No point knowing about the judge if the case isn't solid." He was doing the thing he'd been doing more frequently over the past weeks, looking at her with that particular expression she still didn't have a clean word for. It was somewhere between respect and something more personal, something warmer that he hadn't fully said yet, and she hadn't pressed him on because they were both people who moved carefully toward things that mattered. "You've been building a legal strategy," he said. "I've been building the foundation of one. We'll need an attorney for the actual filing. I know a man in Cheyenne, Webb Calland. He handled my father's land transfer, and he's thorough." "Contact him," she said. "And Colton?" She paused. She'd been using his first name for about 2 weeks now, and it still sometimes caught in her throat slightly, not from reluctance, but from the strangeness of having someone to use it for. "Garrett has friends here. When this moves forward, they'll know about it. We should be prepared for that." "What kind of prepared?" "The kind where we've already thought through every response before they make their first move." She came back to the desk and sat down across from him. "Who are the landowners you think he's connected to?" Vance named 3 men. She recognized 2 of the names from the account records, supply contracts that had been awarded at above-market rates in a way she'd noted but hadn't yet fully contextualized. She pulled the relevant pages from the documentation stack and set them on the desk between them. He looked at the pages. His jaw did the things it did when he was angry but containing it. He was routing money to them through the supply contracts. Possibly, or they were inflating their rates as a courtesy to him and he was keeping the difference. I can't determine which from these records alone. Either way, they knew. "Almost certainly," she said. The fire in the small iron stove in the corner of the office put out a steady, practical heat. Outside, the wind had picked up. The kind of wind that came off the open country north of the ranch and moved through without apology, finding every gap in every structure it encountered. Winter had been establishing itself for the past 3 weeks, in the determined way of Northern Territory winters, adding a few more degrees of cold every 4 or 5 days, tightening its grip incrementally. Vance leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I want to confront him directly," he said, "before the legal filing." Mara considered this. "Why?" "Because I want to look at his face when he understands that I know. I want to see whether he's the kind of man who's ashamed of it." "He's not," she said. He brought his eyes down from the ceiling and looked at her. "Probably not," he agreed. "But I still want to know." She understood that. It wasn't a practical impulse, but it was a human one, and she'd learned over the past weeks that Colton Vance, for all his practical efficiency, had more human impulses than he let most people see. He was better at the ones that didn't show, the patient management of his own anger, the consistent effort to be fair to people who didn't make it easy. He was less good at the ones that required him to let something go before he'd fully examined it. "All right," she said, "but after we've sent the documentation to Calland, not before." "Agreed, Bob." The documentation went to Cheyenne with a trusted writer 2 days later. The attorney's response came back in 12 days. He'd reviewed the materials, agreed the case was strong, and outlined a filing timeline. The legal process would take months, but it was moving. The day after Callan's letter arrived, the first significant snowfall of the season came down. Not a blizzard, not yet, but serious snow, the kind that comes in the night and is still coming when you get up in the morning and shows no particular intention of stopping. By noon, there were 8 inches on the ground and the sky was still white and purposeful. Mara was in the barn checking on the horses when Hoskins came in, stamping snow off his boots and looking at her with an expression that was partway between concern and something more guarded. "We've got a problem on the north pasture," he said. She looked up from the horse she'd been checking, one of the younger mares who'd been showing signs of respiratory distress that she'd been monitoring for 4 days. "What kind?" 3 sections of fence are down, cattle are out." She set down the examination cloth. "How many head?" "Best estimate, 30, maybe 35. Could be more." She did the calculation fast. 30 to 35 cattle loose in 8 inches of snow on open range, with more snow coming, and temperatures that were heading toward the low teens by nightfall. "How long have they been out?" "Don't know. Calloway found it when he went up to check the line this morning. Could have been since before the snow started." That was bad. If they'd been out since last night, they had a head start in conditions that were worsening. "Who do we have available?" 6 men. 2 are already dealing with the blocked drainage situation on the east side. If I pull them off that, we lose the drainage work and potentially leave them on the drainage, she said. 6 men plus me. Which direction were they likely to drift? Hoskins hesitated. Not reluctantly, she had the sense, but because he was genuinely thinking it through. Cattle in a snowstorm drift with the wind. Wind's been running northeast to southwest today. The creek draw in the southwest corner will funnel them. Is there shelter in that draw? Some. Cottonwoods, not much. Then that's where we start. She was already moving toward the equipment at the back of the barn. Get the men ready. I need 10 minutes. Hoskins said, Mrs. Vance? He stopped. It was still strange to her sometimes, hearing that name. The temperature's going to drop hard in the next few hours. If we're not back before dark, we'll be back before dark, she said. It was a more confident statement than the situation strictly warranted, and she knew it. But there was a point in the management of men in difficult conditions where absolute confidence was itself a practical tool, and Hoskins, who had done this for 20 years, knew it too. He nodded and went. Colton wasn't at the ranch when they rode out. He'd left that morning for a meeting with a neighboring landowner about a shared boundary dispute. The legitimate kind, simple disagreement about surveying records from the previous decade, nothing to do with Garrett, and wasn't expected back until early afternoon. Mara left word with Ott in the kitchen and went. The ride to the north pasture took 40 minutes in the snow, which was significantly longer than it should have taken, and told her some fence sections were exactly what Hoskins had described, 3 separate breaks, which was too many to be coincidental deterioration. She looked at the breakpoints without saying anything, but she looked carefully, and what she saw was consistent with deliberate interference, posts that had been worked loose, wire cuts that were clean in the way that weather-related breaks weren't clean. She filed this away and didn't mention it to the men. There was a time for that conversation, and it was not while they were standing in a snowstorm with 30 cattle missing. The drift pattern was exactly as Hoskins had predicted. They found the first cluster of 7 cattle in the creek draw within an hour, bunched against the cottonwood stand with the particular miserable patience of cattle in weather they hate. 2 of the younger hands roped the lead animals and began the process of turning the group back, which took longer than it should have because the snow had shifted the ground contours enough that the cattle were uncertain of their footing. The second group took longer to find. They drifted further than the draw, following a shallow depression in the terrain that Hoskins hadn't accounted for because it wasn't visible in summer. Mara found them by following the logic of the land, imagining she was an animal looking for shelter and least resistance. And they were bunched in a low spot another half-mile southwest, 21 head, 3 of them showing signs of distress. 2 of those need to go back double time, she told Calloway, who was closest. Get them moving first. Don't let the others follow too fast, or you'll lose control of the group. He did it right, which surprised her a little. Or maybe it didn't, because she'd been watching Calloway for 6 weeks, and he had more competence than his bravado generally allowed him to show. He moved the distressed cattle out without disrupting the group, and then came back for the rest. And they worked the 21 animals back toward the fence line in a long, cold, ungainly process that ate the better part of 2 hours. She was soaked through her outer coat by the time they had all the recovered animals moving in the right direction. The snow had slacked slightly, but the temperature had dropped, and she could feel the cold in her hands despite the gloves, deep in the joints, the particular ache that doesn't respond to flexing. She kept moving because stopping was what made cold dangerous. The count, when they were back at the fence and Hoskins tallied it, 33 recovered, 2 still unaccounted for. She looked at the sky. The light had the gray-yellow quality of late afternoon and heavy cloud cover, which meant they had perhaps 90 minutes before dark came down for real. She looked at Hoskins. Northeast, he said, before she could ask. He'd been reading the land the same way she had. If they went northeast instead of southwest, there's a rock formation about a mile out. They might have made for it. Take Calloway and Reyes and go, she said. The rest of us will start the fence repair. In this snow? If we don't close the break tonight, we lose more cattle before morning. She pulled the wire tools from the saddlebag. Go. He went. She repaired fence in the snow with 3 ranch hands, which was exactly as difficult as it sounds, and took every ounce of concentration she had because cold hands and wire were a combination that required absolute attention or someone got hurt. One of the men, a quiet older hand named Pruitt, who rarely spoke but worked with great precision, turned out to know exactly what he was doing with a wire stretcher in difficult conditions, and they fell into an efficient rhythm together that got the first section closed in 40 minutes. Hoskins came back with the 2 missing cattle just before dark. One was a young bull who'd somehow wedged himself behind the rock formation Hoskins had described and taken some minor damage to his left shoulder doing it. The other was fine, just bewildered. 35 cattle, all of them back. They made it to the ranch as the last light was failing, cold and wet and exhausted in the specific way of people who've done hard physical work in bad weather for 6 hours. The kind of exhaustion that goes all the way down to the bone and just sits there. Colton was at the barn when they rode in. He'd been back for 2 hours. Ott had told him what happened. He'd clearly been managing the impulse to ride out after her for 2 hours, and it showed in the set of his shoulders and the very careful way he was holding his expression neutral. He helped with the horses and said nothing until the men had dispersed toward the bunkhouse and the warmth and the supper Ott had held. Then he looked at her. The fence breaks. I know, she said. That's not weather damage. No, she said. It's not. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could hear the specific quality of his anger. Not hot, not explosive, but heavy and cold and patient in the way that the most serious kinds of anger are. Garrett's people, he said. Probably. She unwound the scarf from around her neck and shook the snow from it. They know about the legal filing. Either Callan's office isn't as discreet as he suggested, or they have someone watching the county communication routes. Or both. Or both, she agreed. It doesn't change what we do. It just means we should expect more of this. He looked at her for a long moment. Snow was still in her hair where the hat hadn't fully covered it. Her coat was wet through the outer layer. Her hands, when she pulled off the gloves, were red and stiff. He took her hands in his, both of them, just held them. And the warmth of his palms was so immediate and so unexpected that she had to look away for a second because something in her chest did something she wasn't prepared for. "You should have waited for me," he said. But he said it quietly, without force, and she could hear in the way he said it that he knew she shouldn't have, that waiting would have meant cattle lost and possibly men at risk, that she'd made the right call. He was saying it anyway because he was a man who'd already lost one person who mattered to him, and the knowledge of that was always going to be somewhere underneath everything. "I know," she said. She left her hands in his. "I'll tell you everything I saw at the fence breaks. I want to make sure we're reading the same thing." "After you've eaten something," he said. "After I've eaten something," she agreed. The weeks that followed had the quality of a siege in slow motion. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be pointed to as a single event. Just a persistent low-level pressure applied to the ranch's operations from multiple directions simultaneously. A supply delivery arrived short by 20%, with documentation claiming full delivery. The Faro Land Office sent a query letter about a boundary survey that seemed designed to require a response that would take time and attention away from the legal case. One of the younger ranch hands quit abruptly, giving a reason that didn't fully hold together, and Hoskins told Mara privately that he'd been seen at a saloon in the nearest town having a long conversation with a man. Hoskins recognized as working for one of the 3 landowners Vance had named. Mara tracked all of it. She added pages to the documentation. She wrote letters, carefully worded, to the relevant county offices and to Calland. She made sure that every piece of interference left a paper record, because the men applying the pressure were counting on the difficulty of proving it, and her job was to make sure that when the moment came, the difficulty had already been done. It was grinding work. It lacked the clarity of something like the cattle recovery, where the problem was visible and the effort was physical and the outcome was measurable at the end of the day. This was the less satisfying kind of hard work, the kind that didn't feel like progress even when it was, the kind that required you to trust the process on days when the process seemed to be made entirely of patience and paperwork. She trusted it anyway. She'd spent enough of her life doing work that didn't get recognized to know that unrecognized work was still work, and that it accumulated. The men of Blackstone Ranch were watching her through all of it. She was aware of being watched, not with hostility, not anymore, but with the specific attention of people who are updating their understanding of something. Hoskins had moved to a position of open respect that wasn't announced but was visible in the way he deferred to her in operational decisions and brought her problems before he brought them to Vance. Calloway had made some kind of internal peace with her that he communicated in the way 19-year-olds communicate things, indirectly, through actions, by showing up to help with things she hadn't asked for help with. Even Pruitt, who barely spoke to anyone, had begun saying good morning to her with enough consistency that it had become a kind of ritual. She was not comfortable. She was not without doubt. There were evenings when the weight of the legal case and the ranch management and the ongoing pressure from Garrett's allies and the simple daily difficulty of a cold Wyoming winter piled up into something that sat heavily on her chest in the dark hours, and she lay awake going through lists of what she still didn't know and what might go wrong. She didn't mention this to Colton, not directly, because she didn't want to seem uncertain in front of a man who had placed a significant amount of trust in her, and also because she wasn't sure she had the language for it yet. But he knew anyway. She was learning that about him, that he paid the same quality of attention to her that he paid to land and weather and livestock, the patient, close attention of someone who had learned to read things carefully because the alternative was being caught off guard, and he almost never was. One night in December, when she was still awake at midnight reviewing the correspondence file, he appeared in the office doorway with 2 cups of coffee and looked at her without saying anything for a moment. "The Faro letter," she said without looking up. "I think they're planning to file a counter-complaint about the boundary survey before Callan gets the main case in front of the judge. If they can create enough procedural interference, Mara." She looked up. He set the coffee down in front of her. He sat down on the other side of the desk. "Tell me what you're actually worried about." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm worried that we've built this case very carefully and that they know it's coming and they've had more time than us to think about how to stop it," she said. "I'm worried that careful and right doesn't always win." "It doesn't," he said. "Not always." "That's not reassuring." "I know, but you're not someone who needs to be reassured by things that aren't true." He wrapped his hands around his cup. What would make the case stronger? Not safer, stronger. She thought about it seriously. A witness, she said. Someone who can testify to the arrangement between Garrett and the landowners directly, not just through documentary inference. Someone who was present for the original agreement. Someone who might be willing to talk, if the circumstances were right, Vance said. She looked at him. He had a particular expression, the one that meant he knew something he hadn't said yet. What do you know? I know that Garrett's arrangement with the men around him isn't as comfortable as he'd like it to be right now, Vance said. I've been making some inquiries of my own. What kind of inquiries? The kind where you have careful conversations with people who are starting to feel uncertain about which side of something is going to win. He looked at her steadily. One of the 3 landowners I named. Harmon Fitch. He came to the territory 8 years ago with a bad year behind him, and he's been trying to rebuild since. He's not a bad man who chose this on purpose. He's a man who made a choice when he was desperate, and now he's in deeper than he intended. Mara considered this. You've spoken to him. Once, briefly. I didn't make any promises. I wanted to talk to you first. She looked at him across the desk. The file, the correspondence, the careful documentation she'd been building for 6 weeks. The case that was solid, but not complete. The missing piece she'd identified 30 seconds ago. If Fitch testifies, she said, the other 2 men lose their ability to claim they didn't know, and Garrett's entire structure falls. That's what I thought, Vance said. What does he want? I don't know yet. I think he wants a way out that doesn't destroy him completely. Colton set down his cup. I think he's afraid of what Garrett will do if he turns. Garrett is not... He paused. He's not a man who accepts betrayal without a response. The fire in the office stove was burning low. The wind outside was the December kind, harder than the November wind, with more intention behind it, the wind of a season that has fully arrived and isn't pretending to leave. She thought about the fence breaks in the north pasture, the deliberate clean wire cuts in the snow. She thought about the supply delivery that had come in 20% short. Then we need to be able to offer Fitch something real, she said. And we need to make sure that when Garrett figures out we've spoken to him, there's already enough of the case in front of the court that Garrett can't make the case disappear by making Fitch disappear. Which means the timing matters. The timing matters enormously, she said. We need Callan to file within the next 10 days, before we approach Fitch a second time, before Garrett has any confirmation of what we're planning. Vance was quiet for a moment, and she watched him turn it over. The risk, the logic, the moving pieces. He was a careful thinker, she'd learned. He wasn't impulsive even when he was angry, which was rarer than she'd expected in a man of his particular kind of intensity. All right, he said, I'll ride to Cheyenne myself, in 2 days. I want to speak to Callan in person. Good. She pulled a sheet of paper toward her. I'll write out everything we need to communicate to him tonight. Everything about the Farrow letter and the timing and the Fitch situation, so you go in knowing exactly what to say. He watched her uncap the ink bottle and smooth the paper. He watched her hands, the same hands he'd first looked at in the Henderson gathering, still scarred, still large, still unmistakably themselves. Mara, he said. She looked up. I need to tell you something. He said it with the particular careful weight of a man who has been deciding when to say something and has decided that now is when. When I came to Red Hollow, I told you I was looking for a partner. That was true. What I didn't say, what I didn't know how to say yet, is that I didn't believe I'd find what I was actually looking for. I thought I'd find someone capable, someone adequate to the work. He was looking at her directly. I didn't think I'd find someone who sees the same things I see, in the same way I see them. That's different. He stopped. The fire ticked in the stove. That's more than I planned for. The midnight quiet of the ranch house was complete around them. The wind outside, the distant sound of the horses shifting in the barn, the particular cold silence of a December night in Wyoming. Mara set down the pen. She looked at her husband across the paper and the ink and the careful documentation of other people's dishonesty. I know, she said. It wasn't everything she could have said. She was still learning how to say the rest. But it was true, and he heard it for what it was, and he nodded once in the way he nodded at things that mattered. She picked up the pen again and began to write the letter to Callan. He stayed at the desk across from her while she wrote, drinking his coffee in the quiet, and outside the Wyoming winter pressed against the walls with everything it had, and the walls held. Colton left for Cheyenne 2 days later, before first light, with the letter Mara had written to Callan folded inside his coat pocket, alongside the full copy of the documentation she'd prepared, every entry, every cross-reference, every supplier invoice with its corresponding ledger discrepancy noted in her careful hand. He took Dal with him, his most trusted rider, and said he'd be back in 4 days assuming the roads cooperated, which in December in Wyoming was never a certainty. Mara stood on the porch and watched them ride out into the dark. She went inside and started the kitchen fire and began the day. Running Blackstone Ranch without Colton present turned out to be less different from running it with him than she might have expected 3 months ago, which told her something about how the past months had actually gone. Not that he'd been handing things over to her gradually, but that they'd been making decisions together so consistently that the ranch's operations had become genuinely shared, distributed between them in a way that didn't leave a large gap when one of them was absent. She found this quietly satisfying in the same way she found a well-set fence post satisfying. Not exciting, but solid. The kind of thing that holds. Hoskins ran the daily operations with his usual precision, and Mara handled the office work and the ongoing correspondence with Callan's firm and the county offices, and the ranch moved through its winter rhythms with the disciplined momentum of an operation that had been forced over the past months to tighten its systems and know its own workings better than before. On the second morning after Colton left, Harmon Fitch rode in. She wasn't expecting him. Colton had said he'd approach Fitch after returning from Cheyenne. They'd agreed on the sequence deliberately, wanting the legal filing to be already in motion before any conversation with a potential witness created the possibility of Garrett being tipped off. But Fitch hadn't waited, and the fact that he hadn't waited told her something important about his current state of mind. He came alone, which was either significant or incautious, and possibly both. He was a man in his mid-50s with the look of someone who had made hard choices for long enough that the choices had started to show in his face. Not the weathering of outdoor work, which was a different kind of marking, but something more internal, the particular set of a man who hadn't slept well in a while. His horse was a good one, well kept, which told her he hadn't entirely lost his footing despite whatever else was happening. Hoskins met him at the gate and came to find Mara in the office. "Harmon Fitch is at the front," Hoskins said. He kept his voice neutral, but his eyes were asking. "I'll see him," she said. "In here." She left the documentation where it was, which was a choice she made deliberately. She wanted Fitch to see it if he looked. She wanted him to understand, without being told, the level of preparation that existed on this side of the situation. He came into the office with his hat in his hands. Not performed deference, she didn't think, but genuine discomfort, the hat-holding of a man who doesn't quite know what to do with his hands when he's uncertain. He looked at the stacked files on the desk and the correspondence organized along the south wall, and his face did something complicated. "Mr. Vance isn't here," he said. "No," Mara said. "I am. Sit down, Mr. Fitch." He sat. He looked at her with the reassessing expression she'd gotten used to seeing on men who hadn't known what to expect from her and were finding the actual situation different from their assumptions. "You're the one who found the account problems," he said. "I am." Garrett said. He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "Garrett said you wouldn't find enough to make a case. He said there were too many layers." "He was wrong," she said simply. Fitch looked at his hat. He turned it once in his hands. "How bad is it? For me, specifically?" Mara looked at him for a moment. She'd thought about this conversation, or a version of it, for several weeks. The shape it might take, what she'd need from it, what she was and wasn't willing to offer. She'd thought about it the way she thought about fence repair. You assess the actual damage before you decide what tools you need. You received inflated supply contract rates," she said. "The documentation shows the discrepancy between market rates and what Blackstone was charged. It doesn't currently show a direct communication between you and Garrett establishing the arrangement. What it shows is the financial outcome." She paused. A competent attorney could argue that the pricing was the result of business judgment rather than a deliberate scheme. A competent attorney on the other side could argue the pattern is too consistent to be accidental. Which one wins? "Depends on the judge," she said, "and on what else comes into evidence." He heard what she was saying under what she was saying. His jaw moved. "I want out," he said. It came out rough, like something he'd been holding in his chest for a while and had finally stopped holding. I want to be out of this. I made a bad decision when I needed the contract money, and Garrett made it very easy to say yes, and by the time I understood what the full arrangement was, I was already in it. He looked up at her. I'm not making excuses. I'm explaining the sequence. I understand the sequence, she said. What are you offering? I was present, Fitch said, at a meeting in September of last year, at Bill Cutter's property. Garrett and Cutter and myself, and a man named Aldous Reeve, who runs the freight operation out of the North County. Garrett laid out the arrangement, what he was doing with the Blackstone accounts, how the supply contracts fit in, what each of us would receive. He met her eyes steadily. I can testify to that meeting. I remember it clearly, because it was the point where I understood what I'd gotten into, and I said yes anyway, and I have not had a comfortable night's sleep since. The office was very quiet. The wind outside was the low, persistent kind that didn't gust but just pressed, a constant friction against the north wall. You'd testify in court, Mara said, under oath. Yes. Knowing that Garrett and Cutter and Reeve would know you'd done it. Yes. A pause. I have a daughter. She's 12. I'd like her to grow up with a father who, whatever else, told the truth when he had the chance. He said it without drama, without looking for a reaction, just a plain statement of where he'd arrived. I'd like the arrangement with the supply contracts acknowledged and settled, if that's possible. I'm not asking to be exempt. I'm asking to be given the opportunity to make it right rather than just be made an example of. Mara sat with this for a moment. She thought about Colton in Cheyenne, talking to Calland, filing the papers that would set the legal process in motion. She thought about what a direct eyewitness to the original arrangement would do to the case. It would take something solid and make it nearly unassailable. I can't make you a promise today, she said. My husband needs to be part of this conversation, and so does our attorney. What I can tell you is that what you've described, a willingness to testify and an offer to settle the contract discrepancy, is exactly the kind of cooperation that a court takes into account when determining outcomes. That's as close to a promise as I'm going to get today, Fitch said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, she said. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. He stood, put his hat back on, looked at the files again. He underestimated you considerably, he said. Garrett. He talked about you like you were a temporary problem. I know, Mara said. That was his second mistake. What was his first? Assuming that a ranch with good fundamentals and careful management was vulnerable to what he was doing, she said. It took him 2 years to do enough damage to matter. By the time it mattered, the ranch had someone paying close attention. Fitch looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that she didn't try to name. Then he nodded once, and he left. She sat at the desk for a few minutes after she heard his horse leave the yard. Then she picked up her pen and wrote down everything he'd said, as precisely as she could recall it, with the date and time at the top. She signed it and set it in the file. Then she went to find Hoskins, because there was still a ranch to run. Colton came back from Cheyenne on the 5th day, rather than the 4th, which told her the conversations had taken longer than planned. He came in looking tired in the specific way of a man who has been moving fast for 5 days and managing difficult conversations at the end of it, but underneath the tiredness there was something else, a settled quality, the look of a man who has done what he set out to do. He told her over supper with Hoskins present because Hoskins needed to know Callan had filed. The case was officially before the Faro County Court. The filing included the full documentation and a preliminary request for a hearing date. Callan thinks 60 to 90 days before we get in front of the judge, Colton said. The counterfiling from the Faro Land Office is procedural, and he's not worried about it. He's seen that tactic before. Fitch came while you were gone, Mara said. The table went quiet. Colton looked at her. And? She told him everything. She gave it to him in the same sequence Fitch had given it to her, without editorializing, because Colton needed to hear the shape of it and form his own assessment before they discussed what to do. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, he was at the meeting. Yes? He can name everyone present and testify to the arrangement as it was described. Yes. Hoskins, who had been listening with the stillness of a man who has spent a long time around things that matter, said, That's the case, right there. That's most of the case, Mara said. We need Callan to structure the testimony properly, and we need to make sure Fitch is protected adequately between now and the hearing date. Garrett is going to know within a week that Fitch came here. How do you want to handle that? Colton asked. He asked it like he asked her about water rotation and supply contracts, as a genuine question, not a courtesy. I want to contact Callan tomorrow and brief him on Fitch's visit. I want Fitch's willingness to testify formally documented through the attorney's office as quickly as possible so it's on record before Garrett can get to him. She looked at Colton. And I want to approach Fitch again in person, soon, within the next few days. I want to make sure he hasn't changed his mind, and I want him to understand concretely what cooperation with the court looks like and what it offers him. I'll go with you, Colton said. Yes, she said. I'd like that. The blizzard came on a Wednesday night in late January, 2 weeks after the Fitch conversation, and 3 weeks before the scheduled court hearing. It announced itself the way bad weather in that territory always announced itself. Not suddenly, but with a particular change in the quality of the air, a drop in temperature that was steeper than the usual nightly fall, and a wind that shifted direction in the early evening and began to come from the northwest with a new weight behind it. Hoskins came to the main house at 9 in the evening while Mara was working in the office and said flatly, "It's going to be bad." She looked up. "How bad?" "The worst I've seen in maybe 8 years. I think we're going to get 2 feet, maybe more. The temperature is going to go places I don't want to calculate with people outside." She was already standing. "How many men are in the bunkhouse?" 12. "Dal's cabin is 50 yards from this bunkhouse. He'll be all right if he stays put. The trouble is Reyes and Calloway. They went to fix the south drainage problem this afternoon. They were supposed to be back by dark." Mara looked at the window. The wind was audible now through the glass, a low, insistent sound that hadn't been there an hour ago. "They're not back." "No." She turned to find Colton already in the office doorway. He'd heard. She looked at him and they understood each other without needing to discuss it, the way they'd developed the habit of understanding each other without needing to discuss things, which still struck her sometimes as one of the more remarkable developments of the past several months. "South drainage is 2 miles, Colton said. "In building weather, with the temperature dropping," Mara said. "We can't wait to see if they come in on their own." "No," he agreed. "I'll go." "We'll go," she said. He looked at her for half a second. "Mara, 2 people," she said. "Better than 1. And I know the south drainage route as well as you do." He knew she was right. She could see him knowing it. "Suit up heavy," he said. "Everything you've got." They went out into the beginning of the blizzard with 2 horses and 2 lanterns and every layer either of them owned. The cold was a different animal than the cold of the cattle recovery in November. That had been serious winter weather, but this was winter weather that meant it. The wind was strong enough to push against them physically, and the snow was already coming horizontally in the lantern light, which reduced visibility to perhaps 15 feet in any direction. Mara rode with her head down and her sense of direction grounded in the land rather than what she could see of it. The slope of the terrain under the horse's feet, the particular way the wind came off the ridge to the northwest, the relationship between those 2 things and where the south drainage had to be. She'd ridden this direction enough times now that the land had a shape in her mind, independent of what her eyes could show her. The horses were unhappy but working. Colton rode slightly ahead, and she could see his lantern as a smear of orange through the snow, barely. They found Reyes first, on foot, about 3/4 of a mile from the ranch. He'd lost his horse somewhere in the dark. The animal had spooked at something, and he'd come off and the horse had gone, and he'd been walking back and was not yet in serious trouble but was getting there, the particular wooden quality starting to come into his movements that told you a person's body was beginning to make decisions without consulting their mind. Colton got him up behind his saddle without ceremony and handed him the lantern. "Hold that level," he said. "Point it south." "Calloway's still out there," Reyes said. His voice was slightly thick. "I know," Colton said. He looked at Mara. "Keep going," she said, and turned her horse further south. She found Calloway 12 minutes later, and those 12 minutes were the longest of the evening because the visibility had dropped further and the temperature had dropped with it. And there were moments where she was operating almost purely on instinct and the knowledge of the land that she'd built up over months of working it daily. She found him because she heard the horse first. The animal had stopped moving and was standing with its back to the wind in the shelter of a shallow depression in the terrain, which was sensible horse behavior, and Calloway was still on it, which meant he'd had the presence of mind to let the horse find shelter rather than fighting it. He was in worse shape than Reyes. He'd been out longer, and the cold had gotten into him in a more serious way, and when she brought her horse alongside his and called his name, the response was slower than she wanted. "Calloway? Pete, look at me." He looked at her. His face was wrong in the lantern light, the particular grayish tone that came before serious cold injury. "Can you hold your reins?" she said. "Yeah," he said. It came out slightly slurred. "Hold them then. We're going to move. Stay on the horse. That's the only thing you have to do." She didn't have Colton's strength to get him up on her horse, even if she'd wanted to attempt a transfer in these conditions. What she had was her rope, which she tied from her saddle to the bridle of Calloway's horse so the animal would follow hers, and her knowledge of the direction back to the ranch, and the absolute certainty that the only useful thing was to keep moving. She moved. Calloway stayed on his horse, which was the only thing she'd asked of him, and she talked to him while they rode. Not meaningful conversation, just a continuous low voice giving him something to track, something to keep his mind anchored to. She called his name every 30 seconds. She described where they were going. She told him about the kitchen stove and Ott's coffee and the bunkhouse fire. Small, concrete, specific things that a person can hold on to when the cold starts making everything abstract. She got him back to the ranch in 40 minutes. Hoskins was waiting with 2 other men, and they got Calloway off the horse and into the bunkhouse with the efficiency of people who had done this or something like it before, and the ranch closed itself around the emergency with the collective competence of an operation that had learned, over the past months, to function as something more than a collection of individual workers. Colton was already back. He'd gotten Reyes inside and warmed and was standing in the bunkhouse doorway when Mara came in with Calloway, and the look on his face when she walked through the door was something she filed away in the private part of herself where she kept things that mattered. The blizzard ran for 18 hours. 2 feet of snow, drifts considerably higher on the north sides of every structure. The temperature got to places that warranted the concern Hoskins had had about calculating them. Mara slept for 4 hours in the middle of it, because she'd learned in the past months that pushing past the point of genuine exhaustion made her less reliable rather than more dedicated, and reliability was the actual thing the ranch needed. She was up before the blizzard ended, in the pre-dawn dark with the wind still running, making sure the animals were accounted for, and the feed situation was manageable, and that Calloway's color was returning to something closer to normal. It was. By morning he was sitting up and drinking coffee and had the slightly chastened look of a young man who had been very cold and was thinking about that. She stopped by his bunk before she went to start the day's work. He looked up at her. "You came back for me," he said. "You're a Blackstone hand," she said. "Of course I did." It wasn't a speech. She didn't mean it as one. But she could see it land in him, the simple factual statement of it, the way belonging to something gets confirmed sometimes by the most direct and undramatic means. The next 3 weeks had the post-crisis quality of periods that follow hard things, a tenderness in how the men moved around each other, a slight loosening of the defenses that people keep up in ordinary times. Calloway had come through the cold without lasting damage, some tenderness in his hands and feet for about a week, then nothing permanent. And the relief of that ran through the bunkhouse in a way that was visible if you were paying attention. Mara was always paying attention. She noticed that the men had begun, without anything being announced, without any explicit shift in the order of things, to treat her as a fixed point of the ranch rather than a variable one. Problems came to her that had previously gone to Hoskins first, not because Hoskins was being bypassed, but because she'd become part of the natural circuit. Even Pruitt, who communicated mostly through proximity and gesture and the strategic deployment of competent action, had started a habit of working near wherever Mara was working, which was as close as he came to declaring solidarity. She found herself in quiet moments thinking about Red Hollow, about the Henderson gathering and the laughter and Eliza's hands on her wrist, about what her father's face had looked like across the kitchen table that morning when Vance had come to call. She thought about these things not with the specific pain she'd carried them with in the first weeks. That pain hadn't fully resolved, and she wasn't sure it was supposed to, but with a different quality of attention, the way you examine something from a better vantage point and see its actual dimensions more clearly. She had been invisible for 32 years. Not because she was small, she had never been small, but because the work she did didn't make noise, the fence posts that didn't fall, the accounts that stayed in order, the animals that were cared for, the family ranch that hadn't gone under despite everything pushing it toward going under. Invisible work, sustained across years, that everyone around her had depended on without fully registering that it was happening. She thought about that. And then she thought about Blackstone Ranch in the months since she'd arrived, and she thought about the documentation that was currently sitting in Webb Callan's Cheyenne office, precisely built, every discrepancy accounted for, signed and dated and ready. She thought about the fence breaks on the north pasture in the November snow, the clean wire cuts she hadn't missed, the supply short delivery with its fraudulent documentation, the systematic small thefts in the Blackstone ledgers over 2 years, all of it now laid out in plain daylight. Invisible work, again, but the kind that was about to stop being invisible. The letter from Callan came on a Thursday morning in early February, 2 weeks before the scheduled hearing. It was addressed to both of them, which she noticed, and which still carried a small charge of meaning that she was still not entirely accustomed to. She read it first because Colton was out with Hoskins dealing with a horse that had developed a problem overnight, and she read it standing at the office desk in her coat because she'd just come in from outside. The letter said, Harmon Fitch had contacted Callan's office directly and formalized his willingness to testify. His statement had been taken, witnessed, and filed with the court. Additionally, and this was the part that made her read the sentence twice, a second individual, a freight manager named Aldous Reeve, had also contacted Callan's office. Separately from Fitch, without apparent coordination with him. Reeve's situation was messier, his involvement deeper, but his stated motivation was similar. He had a family, he had been in over his head for 2 years, and he believed the arrangement was going to collapse regardless, and he preferred to be on the right side of the collapse. 2 witnesses. 2 people who had been present at the original meeting, who could describe it in specific terms, independently, with consistent accounts. Mara set the letter down on the desk. She stood in the quiet office with the winter light coming through the north window. And she thought about Douglas Garrett, who had sat in this office for 2 years and moved money out of it in careful small amounts, and believed that the size of the ranch and the complexity of the accounts would protect him indefinitely. Who had, when Colton brought her to Blackstone, apparently calculated that she was manageable, a temporary disruption, a new wife who would find her footing and then operate within the visible surface of things, and leave the underneath of things to people who understood it. She heard Colton's boots on the porch. He came in and read her face before he read the letter. She could see him doing it, the quick assessment he always ran when he walked into a room where she was, and he said, "Good news or complicated news?" "Both," she said. "Mostly good." She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched his face, which didn't change dramatically, but shifted in the way of someone absorbing something significant. A slight release of tension around his jaw, a change in the quality of his stillness. "Reeve," he said. Separately from Fitch, she said, that's what matters. 2 independent witnesses, consistent accounts. Collins' note on the second page says this effectively resolves the remaining evidentiary gaps. Colton set the letter down. He looked at the documentation stacked along the wall, weeks of her work, the careful paper trail she'd built from the first day she'd sat down with the ledgers. He looked at it for a moment in a way that wasn't quite an assessment, because it was something more personal than that. "He thought we'd miss it," Colton said. "Not about Reeve. About Garrett." "He thought I'd miss it," Mara said. She said it plainly, without heat. "He didn't know what kind of person I was. He assumed." Colton looked at her. "His mistake." "One of them," she said. Outside, the February light on the snow was sharp and clean and very bright, the kind of light that comes when the sky is clear after weeks of weather and everything reflects everything else. The land around Blackstone ran in every direction under it, enormous and patient, asking nothing except the full measure of whoever stood on it. In 3 weeks, Douglas Garrett would stand in front of a Faro County judge with 2 witnesses against him and an evidence file that had no gaps in it, and the structure he'd built over 2 careful years was going to come apart in the way that carefully constructed, dishonest things came apart, completely and without recovery. Mara thought about this and felt not triumph exactly. Triumph was too clean an emotion for something this complicated, but a deep, settled satisfaction, the particular feeling of work done correctly and completely, the work that doesn't make noise right up until the moment it does. She picked up her pen. There were still things to prepare before the hearing, and she intended to be ready for all of them. The hearing was set for a Tuesday in late February, and Mara spent the 2 weeks before it the way she spent most things that mattered. Not by worrying exactly, but by preparing until there was nothing left to prepare, and then checking the preparation once more. Callan had been thorough. The documentation she'd built was entered into the court record in full. Fitch's sworn statement was there, and Reeves, and the two of them told the same story from slightly different angles the way honest accounts of the same event tend to do. Not word for word identical, which would have suggested coordination, but consistent in every material fact, the kind of consistency that comes from people independently describing something that actually happened. Callan had told Colton privately that he hadn't seen a fraud case this cleanly documented in his 22 years of practice, and Colton had told Mara, and she'd received it the way she received most compliments, with a brief nod and a mental note to keep working. Garrett had retained an attorney from Cheyenne. She found this out through Callan's office, and she looked up the man's record the same way she'd looked up the judge's record, through public court filings and correspondence available at the county offices. He was competent, not exceptional. He would do what he could with what he had, which was not much. The night before the hearing, she and Colton sat in the kitchen after supper with the last of the coffee between them. The ranch was quiet. Outside, the February dark was complete and cold, but it was the dry cold of late winter rather than the brutal pressing cold of the blizzard weeks. And there was something in the quality of it that felt like the season had passed its worst point and was beginning reluctantly to consider turning. "How are you feeling?" Colton asked. She thought about this honestly, rather than answering automatically. "Steady," she said. "The work is done. Whatever happens in that room tomorrow comes from what's already been built. I can't change it now, and I don't need to." He looked at her across the table. "You've been saying some version of that since the day I met you." "What version?" "The version where you've already done the thing that matters and you're at peace with the outcome." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "Most people can't get there. They keep pulling at it." "I pull at things plenty," she said, "just not in front of people." He smiled at that, a small, genuine one, the kind she'd come to recognize as his real smile as opposed to the social one. "I know," he said. "I live here." She looked at him. There were things she still hadn't said, not because she didn't mean them, but because she was still, even after these months, learning how to say them without feeling like she was handing something over that she might not get back. She was working on this. She was better at it than she'd been in November. "Whatever comes out of tomorrow," she said, "I want you to know that this, all of this, the case, the ranch, the past months, I haven't just been doing a job." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I know that too. I'm saying it anyway," she said, "because I don't say things enough." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, the way he'd held her hands in the barn after the cattle recovery. Warmth and contact and nothing that required anything more to be said. She turned her hand over and held his for a moment and then let go, because they both had to be sharp tomorrow and it was late. She slept well, which surprised her a little. The Faro County Courthouse was a substantial building for the territory. 2 stories, solid construction, with the particular gravity of a place that had been making permanent decisions for long enough that the permanence had settled into the walls. Mara and Colton arrived early. Callan was already there, a lean man of 50 with a precise manner and the quality of attention that good attorneys develop over long years of consequence. Garrett arrived with his attorney 20 minutes before the hearing was scheduled. Mara watched him come in from across the room, and she was struck by how ordinary he looked. Medium height, middle-aged, the kind of face that wouldn't be remarkable in any room. Nothing about him said what he'd done. That was always the thing about people who stole slowly and carefully, she thought. They looked like everyone else because they'd spent a great deal of effort making sure of it. He glanced toward her and Colton. The glance was controlled, but she caught what was underneath it before he locked it down. Not shame, not quite, but a kind of angry assessment, a man calculating and finding the numbers don't work in his favor. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, because she didn't need anything from that exchange. The hearing took 4 hours. Callan presented the documentation in sequence, building from the earliest account discrepancies through to the final months of Garrett's employment. Each piece connected to the next, the pattern made plain by the ordering of the evidence in a way that required no dramatic language because the numbers told the story without assistance. The judge, a deliberate man named Cowell, with a reputation for reading documents rather than performances, went through the key exhibits with the focused attention of someone who had already read them once and was confirming his reading. Garrett's attorney raised 4 objections, and Calland addressed each one with the specific entry in the documentation that answered it. The judge sustained none of the objections. Fitch testified for 40 minutes. He was not a comfortable witness. He was clearly a man who found sitting in that chair painful, not because he was lying, but because he was telling the truth about something that implicated him. And that discomfort was, Calland had told them beforehand, likely to work in their favor. Comfortable witnesses were often smooth ones. Uncomfortable witnesses often looked like what they were. People telling the truth about things they wished they hadn't done. He named the meeting. He named the people present. He described the arrangement in precise terms. The supply contract inflation, the account skimming, the division of proceeds. He described Garrett laying it out with the specific confidence of a man who had done this before and expected it to work again. He said, when Garrett's attorney pressed him on why he was testifying, because I have a daughter and I intend to look her in the eye for the rest of my life. Garrett's attorney did not have much to work with after that. Reeves' written statement was entered into record. The judge read it in full without rushing. When the hearing concluded, Judge Cowell took 40 minutes to deliberate. He returned with a ruling that found the evidence sufficient to establish civil fraud, ordered full restitution of the documented amount plus court costs, and referred the matter to the county prosecutor for consideration of criminal charges. He noted, in language that was measured and precise and hit like something heavy, that the documentation presented was among the most thorough his court had received in a civil fraud matter, and that the cooperation of witnesses who had voluntarily come forward had been appropriately considered. Douglas Garrett sat very still when the ruling was read. His attorney wrote something on a piece of paper and slid it to him, and he read it and said nothing. His face had the particular closed-down quality of a man who has understood, in a concrete and immediate way, that the structure he built is gone. Mara watched him for a moment. She'd expected to feel something more pronounced, satisfaction or relief, or some version of the completion that hard work earns. What she felt was quieter than that. Something more like the feeling of setting down a heavy thing after carrying it for a long time. Not the drama of putting it down, just the plain physical fact of the weight being gone. Calland shook their hands outside the courthouse, with the particular warmth of a man who takes genuine pleasure in work that ends the right way. He went over the next steps: the criminal referral timeline, the restitution process, the follow-up documentation that would be needed. Mara asked 3 questions and took notes. On the ride back to Blackstone, she and Colton were quiet for most of it, the comfortable quiet of people who don't need to fill things. The February land stretched around them under a sky that had gone the pale clear blue of late winter, the sun still low but present, doing its thin cold work. "Fitch," Colton said after a while. "I know," she said. "We need to follow through. Calland already has the settlement framework. The contract discrepancy gets repaid at cost over 18 months. It won't be easy for him, but it won't break him." "Good." She looked at the land. "He told the truth when it was hard to. That deserves something real in return." Colton glanced at her. "You have more patience for people's complicated situations than I do." "I've been in complicated situations," she said. "It's easier to have patience for something you recognize." Spring came to Blackstone. The way it came to that part of Wyoming, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard freeze, followed by mud, followed by the first genuinely clear days that smelled like something living rather than something held in suspension. The cattle came through the winter with losses that were lower than average, which Hoskins attributed to the improved feed rotation, which he and Mara had revised together in December. The south pasture drainage, which Reyes and Callaway had been fixing when the blizzard caught them, had held through the rest of the season. Life on Blackstone had a rhythm to it now that she was part of rather than learning. She knew which horses were reliable and which required attention, which sections of fence line needed checking first after a hard wind, which of the hands would come to her with problems early and which would wait too long, and which, like Pruitt, communicated the presence of a problem through proximity and expression rather than words. She knew the account books the way she knew the land, not just the current state of them, but their history, the story they told about where the operation had been and where it was going. She had begun making notes about the next phase, not just maintenance, but expansion. There was a section of the northeastern territory that Colton had considered for additional grazing and dismissed as too remote, but she'd looked at the water sources and the access routes, and she thought the calculation was worth revisiting with current numbers. She'd been building the case for it quietly, the same way she built every case, methodically, without announcing it until it was ready. She was ready to announce it in April, and she did, in the office one evening after supper, spreading the maps and the figures across the desk, while Colton sat back and listened with the focused attention he always gave her when she presented something. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The water access," he said. "You've confirmed this with the county survey records?" "Cross-referenced against 3 surveys from different years," she said. "The source is reliable in dry seasons and has historically been reliable in drought years. I have the records." "Of course you do," he said. He said it with a warmth in his voice that was becoming more natural between them, less like something he'd decided to show her, and more like something that came out when he wasn't monitoring it. He studied the map for another minute. "This is good, Mara." "I know," she said. He looked up at her and laughed, a short, genuine sound, and she found herself smiling back, which was still slightly surprising to her sometimes, the ease of it. They were not a perfect match, and they both knew it. He held things too long before he said them, a habit from years of being the only person who needed to know his own thinking, and she sometimes moved faster than he was ready for, acting on conclusions she'd reached before she'd brought him along in the reasoning. They'd had 2 arguments of real substance in the past months, one about the timing of the legal confrontation with Garrett, which she had been right about and which he'd acknowledged, and one about a management decision regarding one of the senior hands that she had been wrong about and had also acknowledged. The acknowledgments on both sides had been brief and direct, and immediately followed by moving on to what was next, which she found to be perhaps the most functional aspect of their particular kind of partnership. She thought about this sometimes, about what it meant to be in something real, as opposed to something performed. She had watched people perform marriages her whole life, the right presentation, the correct surface, the management of what other people saw. She had never before this been in something where the point was not the presentation, but the actual work of 2 people building a life that could hold weight. It held weight. That was the thing. When the blizzard came, it held. When the legal case ground through its months of preparation, it held. When she made mistakes, and when he made mistakes, and when the ranch had bad weeks, and the winter was brutal, and the pressure from Garrett's allies was grinding and relentless, through all of it, the thing they were building held. She didn't have a clean word for what that felt like. She was still finding the language for it. Eliza arrived on a Thursday morning in May, which was 5 months after the Henderson gathering and 4 months after Mara had left Red Hollow, and she came without warning, which was very like Eliza. The assumption that her arrival was something that would be accommodated rather than something that needed to be arranged. Mara was in the yard when the wagon came up the road. She recognized her sister at a distance, recognized the particular way she sat, and she had several seconds to decide how she felt about this before Eliza was close enough to see her face. She felt primarily tired. Not dramatically, not bitterly. Just the ordinary tiredness of a person who has carried something for a long time and set it down and does not particularly want to pick it up again. She also felt, underneath that, something more complicated. The same complicated thing she'd always felt about Eliza. The mixture of closeness and grief, and the particular sorrow of watching someone you grew up alongside make choices you could never quite understand. She stood where she was and waited. Eliza climbed down from the wagon without help. The driver had already moved to the horses, and she crossed the yard to where Mara was standing, and she looked different from the last time Mara had seen her. Not older exactly, though there was some of that. More like the particular look of someone who has lost the thing they organized themselves around and hasn't yet figured out what to organize themselves around instead. The ease was gone. The specific confidence of someone who has always been chosen had been replaced by something more uncertain, and uncertainty on Eliza's face was so unfamiliar that it took Mara a moment to read it. "Mara," Eliza said. "Eliza," Mara said. They stood in the spring morning with the yard between them and the sounds of the ranch going on around them, horses, and the men at the near pasture, and the wind that was still cool this time of year, even when the sun was warm. "I should have written first," Eliza said. "Yes," Mara said. "Not unkindly, just plainly." Eliza's mouth pressed together. She had the look of someone who had rehearsed something and was finding the rehearsal inadequate to the actual moment. "Father told me what happened, with the court case, with the ranch." She looked around the yard, the size of the operation, the scope of it, the unmistakable evidence of something that worked, something built. "He told me, he said you were the reason the case came together, that you found everything." "That's accurate," Mara said. Eliza looked back at her. "I need help," she said. It came out stripped of everything extra, which Mara suspected cost her something. "I trusted someone I shouldn't have trusted. I thought—" She stopped, shook her head. "It doesn't matter what I thought. I'm in a bad situation, and I've run out of easy options." Mara had known this moment was possible. She'd thought about it in the abstract, what she would feel, what she would say, in the months since Red Hollow. She'd thought about the Henderson gathering and Eliza's hands on her wrist and the laughter that had erupted through that room, and she'd tried to be honest with herself about what she carried from it. Not to resolve it into something cleaner than it was, just to know it accurately. What she knew, Eliza had done a cruel thing on a night when she was frightened and self-serving and incapable of being otherwise. What she also knew, Eliza had always been frightened of the kind of life that required more from you than you thought you had. The cruelty and the fear were not separate things. They were the same thing, expressed outward instead of inward, which was the direction weak moments tend to push people. This was not an excuse. It was just the truth of the thing, as honestly as Mara could see it. "What kind of help?" Mara said. Eliza told her. It was not a simple situation. There was a man involved, money borrowed against expectations that didn't materialize. A chain of decisions that had each seemed reasonable in isolation and had combined into something that wasn't. Mara listened without interrupting. She asked 2 clarifying questions. She was quiet for a moment after Eliza finished. "There's work here," Mara said. "Legitimate work. OT needs help in the kitchen and the house. And in another month, when we start expanding the Northeast grazing section, we're going to need someone who can manage the supply correspondence for that operation." She looked at her sister. "The correspondence work requires attention to detail and reliability. It's not interesting. It's important." Eliza looked at her. "You'd give me work." "I'm offering you work," Mara said. "Those are different things. You'd earn a wage. You'd have a place to sleep. You'd build something that belongs to you rather than something borrowed from someone else's expectations." The gap between them was still there. Mara wasn't pretending it wasn't. There was no moment of embrace, no dissolution of everything that had happened into something clean and resolved. That wasn't how real things worked, and Mara had been done with the pretense of clean resolution for most of her adult life. But she was also done carrying the Henderson gathering as an open wound. She'd set down enough heavy things this year to know that carrying them past the point of usefulness was its own kind of choice, and she was choosing differently. "It was wrong," Eliza said quietly. "What I did. In front of everyone." "Yes," Mara said. I was so afraid of being left behind, and I took that out on you." "I know," Mara said. "That doesn't make it smaller, but I understand the sequence." She paused. "Same as I understood Fitch." Eliza looked at her without quite understanding the reference, and that was fine. She didn't need to understand it. It was a thought Mara was having for herself, about the particular similarity between the 2 situations and what she believed about people who make bad choices under pressure and are then given a concrete chance to do better. She believed in the chance, not the performance of redemption, not the dramatic gesture of it, but the daily grinding actual work of becoming someone different than the person who made the mistake. She believed in the work. She always had. "The supply correspondence," Eliza said. "I can do that." "I believe you," Mara said. "Come inside. I'll show you where things are." Summer came in fully by June. The northeastern expansion was underway. The water source had held exactly as the survey records predicted, and the grazing section was supporting 40 head more than the previous year's numbers. The account books were clean, maintained now by a system Mara had designed that made the kind of manipulation Garrett had used structurally impossible. Too many cross-references, too many points where any discrepancy would become immediately visible. The criminal referral from the civil case had resulted in charges filed against Garrett and Cutter. Reeve had accepted a plea arrangement. Garrett's case would go to a full trial in the fall. Mara had been notified she would likely be called as a witness, which she was prepared for, having prepared for it since February. Harmon Fitch was making his restitution payments on schedule. He'd sent a note through Callan's office in April, not to Colton, but to Mara specifically, thanking her for what he called the most straightforward conversation he'd had in 3 years. She'd read it and put it in the file and gone back to work. Her father came to visit in July, making the journey with the assistance of his neighbor's wagon. His hip no better, but no worse. And he spent 4 days at Blackstone walking the property slowly and talking with Colton about cattle in the way that two men who understand cattle talk about it, long and specific and without hurry. He ate Ott's cooking with unreserved appreciation. He watched his daughters move through the same space, doing different work, and his face had the complicated expression that it had worn since the morning Colton Vance had come to the Whitmore kitchen table. On the last evening of his visit, he sat with Mara on the porch while the sun was going down over the western range, that long, late summer light that made everything look like something worth keeping. "I owe you things I don't have words for," he said. She looked at him. He was older than she usually let herself see him, sitting in the porch light, slower, more careful, the body of a man who had worked hard for a long time and was running up against the account of it. "You raised me to work," she said. "That's what I've done." "I raised you to work and I let you disappear into it," he said. "I let you be the fence post, the thing that holds everything up that nobody notices until it's gone." She was quiet for a moment. "I noticed," she said. That was enough. He looked out at the land. Was it? She thought about this honestly, the way she tried to think about everything, without softening it into something easier than it was. Had it been enough, all those years? The answer was no, not entirely. It had not been enough to be invisible, to be useful without being seen, to carry things that were never acknowledged. That had hurt. It had hurt for a long time, and parts of it still did, in the way that old injuries live in the body as weather sensitivity rather than sharp pain. But she had also learned something from those years that she couldn't have learned any other way. How to build things that hold without anyone watching. How to work when there is no audience. How to trust the work itself as the measure of worth, not the recognition of it, because recognition is unreliable and the work is real regardless of whether anyone sees it. She would not have been ready for Blackstone without Red Hollow. She would not have known how to read a set of fraudulent accounts, or manage men who doubted her, or ride out into a blizzard after 2 missing hands, or sit across from Harmon Fitch and hear a complicated man's complicated truth if she hadn't spent 32 years doing hard things in the dark. "It made me who I am," she said finally. "That has to count for something." Gerald Whitmore looked at his daughter in the late light, and he nodded, and for the first time in her memory he looked at her with his whole face, nothing held back, no part of his attention reserved elsewhere. "It counts for everything," he said. The sun went down over the western range of Blackstone Ranch, and the sky went its long, slow gradient from gold to orange to the particular blue that precedes dark, and the land settled into evening with the patience of something that has been here long before any of this and will be here long after. Mara sat with her father and watched it. There is a thing people say about worth, that it has to be earned, that it must be proven, that it lives in the opinions of others and is therefore always provisional, always subject to revision, always one bad room or one cruel moment away from being taken back. She had believed some version of this for most of her life, and the believing of it had sat inside her like a cold thing she couldn't quite get warm. What she knew now, at the end of a year that had asked everything from her and given back more than she'd known to ask for, was that worth was not a verdict. It was not something granted by a room full of people or withheld by a sister's shove or confirmed by a wealthy man's choice on a gathering room floor. Those things could reflect it, but they could not create it and they could not destroy it. Worth was what you built when nobody was watching. It was the fence posts that held, the account books that were clean, the hands that went out in a blizzard for 2 people who needed finding, the careful documentation that left no gap for dishonesty to slip through. It was the long, unglamorous daily accumulation of being exactly who you were, not who you were expected to be, not who the room decided you were, but who you actually were. In the work, in the difficult moments, in the choices made when the only witness was yourself. The woman who had stood in the Henderson gathering with dirty hands and a room full of laughter around her had not become someone else. She had simply arrived, after a long journey, at a place where the person she'd always been was finally visible. She was visible now. She intended to stay that way. Colton came out onto the porch and stood behind her chair, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. A plain, unremarkable gesture, the kind that happens between people who have stopped performing things for each other and are simply present. And the three of them sat while the sky completed its change and the stars began their work, and the land held everything, the way it always had, quietly and without being asked.